welcome. I'm so happy to see you. And I'm also very happy to see the entire group that's on the call today for this fireside chat. And it's really my pleasure to have the honor of introducing Melanie. I've known Melanie for, I don't know, I added up the years, but I know it's more than a decade, and that's all I will admit to. But I first met Melanie when she was doing consulting work for Johns Hopkins University, where I was located. And she was especially working on supporting schools of continuing and professional education. So she is one of us, and she's one of you for many, many reasons, not the least of which is that she understands what we do, but she teaches, she obviously writes, she's an artist, she is very passionate about social justice and gender equality. And she's a lifelong learner. So all of these things are very near and dear to my heart, and I know they are to yours as well. I've known her really long before she joined the hashtag Great Resignation and decided to finish her novel and begin to chart this new path of her professional journey. So I take great pride actually in her accomplishments, and I've benefited greatly from her knowledge and expertise, and I know that all of you will as well. Her book is award-winning. It's an award-winning novel that's entitled Beyond Leaning In. And as one of the people who had the privilege of being a pre-published reader, I can assure you that this is a very different kind of business book. It's based on research, but it's told as just a fascinating novel, and it lends itself for the kind of discussion that I hope is going to happen today in this fireside chat. I think Melanie was very intentional in selecting the title of her book. And I'm sure she's going to go into this in more detail. But the idea of leaning in really presupposes that women have to be more like men, interrupt, take up space, talk louder. I think I do a lot of those things. And women are socialized more to be listeners, people who understand. Empathy is very important. But the point that Melanie has made in her book, and I know that she'll be making when she speaks to all of you, is that these skills of listening and understanding and empathizing are the kinds of traits that everybody should have, no matter the gender. These are very important traits, especially in this world where we find ourselves today. So I don't want to take up any more time other than to say not only is Melanie an award-winning author, but she's the founder of Strategic Imagination, which is a firm that's dedicated to the power of the arts to help businesses and nonprofits achieve transformational change. As I mentioned previously, she was the SVP at a company called EAB Global, which many of you may be aware of, an education technology and consulting firm. Thank you, Aubrey, for putting the link to her website. And she started her career teaching literature at UCLA, where she received her PhD in English. So, Melanie, I am so pleased that you're able to join us for this fireside chat. And I also apologize that I will be unable to stay for the fireside chat because of another meeting. But I know that your perspectives on DEI and gender equity issues and just general social social justice issues will be of great interest to the folks that are on this call. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Melanie Ho to the Forbes School of Business and Technology, and specifically to the Center for Women's Leadership. So Melanie, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah, and thank you all of you for joining me today. I'm really excited to be here. As Dr. Steinberg mentioned, a question I often get to begin with is what inspired me to write this book, and why we have to go beyond leaning in. So maybe I can start there, and then Aubrey, I know you had some questions too that we can get to.
Absolutely, yes, take it away. Thank you so much, Dr. Steinberg.
Yes, thank you, Aubrey, for setting everything up. Very much appreciate it.
Of course.
Well, as Dr. Steinberg mentioned, the title of my book, Beyond Leaning In, calls back to Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, which was published in 2013. And I'll talk a little bit more about the book, but first I'll say that was the same year that I was promoted to a senior position at work. I went from managing 4 people to 70 almost overnight. And in that process, I began to see a lot of things. First of all, I began to realize some of the challenges that I was facing as a woman advancing in a leadership position. And I think I had always before that kind of looked up and thought, oh, well, it will get easier as I get more senior. And actually, the opposite happened. It started to get harder. I saw more challenges for women. And also I saw more challenges because suddenly I had transparency into the careers of not just myself and my friends, as had happened before that, but now all of the women and the men who reported to me. I started to see the subtle ways in which they were treated differently by colleagues, by clients. I also was now at the senior table at my firm, and I started to get a sense of the career paths and discussions around the staff of my colleagues as well. And in that, started to see again all of the different ways that women and men were talked about differently. So when Sheryl Sandberg published her book, Lean In, about the challenges that women face and the fact that women need to often be more confident, to take our seats at the table, to raise our hands for opportunities, at first I was inspired and excited. I had been a big fan of Sheryl Sandberg's TED Talk, which is titled, I can't remember exactly what it's titled, but it's about how women need to be able to feel more confident in the workplace and how often a lack of confidence holds women back. It had come out a few years before that. My friends and I all watched it. We circulated it. We emailed each other about it. We posted it on social media. I had friends who would listen to it before they were about to ask for a raise or a promotion. And it was really empowering. And so when Lean In came out, at first I was excited because it was a book by a Facebook executive. And because she had such this viral TED Talk, was such a powerful person at such an important company, it felt like suddenly the world was talking about this book, Lean In, and that would mean that the world was talking about the challenges women face at work. My excitement, though, quickly turned to disappointment. I like to think of it as, I say corporate America like sound bites, but when I say corporate America, I'm referring to employer culture generally, because I think that a lot of the norms of corporate America, as Dr. Steinberg mentioned, I've spent a lot of my career in higher education, that whether we're talking about colleges and universities or healthcare organizations or nonprofits or government, they all behave according to a lot of the same norms as to what is needed in employment organizations. And that is often a desire for sound bites, for simple solutions that could be put on one PowerPoint slide. And this idea of lean in, I think, was attractive to a lot of employers because it was 2 words that could solve anything. I started to see that the phrase lean in almost got weaponized. Sheryl Sandberg in Lean In is very specific. She talks about how this idea that women need to lean in is only one part of the problem. But I think that it became a convenient soundbite so that anytime the challenges that women were brought up in my workplace and in others, what we would often hear is, okay, well, this can be solved by women needing to lean in. And I started to think about this as, well, it's harder for women to lean in when we are strapped back in our seats. I kind of imagined a giant seatbelt that would be those systemic and cultural barriers that we'll talk a little bit more about today. I'm going to show one quick comic before I ask Audrey what her next question is. And this is just an example of the kinds of things I was seeing at the time that Lean In was published. Researchers refer to this as the prove it again phenomenon. This is based on a scene from my book where we'll actually meet these two characters, Chad and Haley. And you see on the left side how Chad is often discussed, that Chad is inexperienced, but he did a great job on that project. Let's bet with and promote him. Versus Haley did a great job on that project, but she's inexperienced. We'll have to see more. And what I really wanted to show in this comic is if you look at it side by side, it's the exact same words. Both Chad and Haley don't have a lot of experience yet. They're fairly early in their careers. They both actually did a great job on one project. It shows a lot of promise. But you see for Chad and Haley, the pro and the con are reversed. They both have a but in Chad's case, the but is the reason to bet with him, promote him. I talked to one woman I interviewed for my book who mentioned that during career discussions of the staff on her team, she would take a note every single time the phrase bet with was used for a man, and it was pretty frequent. And on the right side, what research shows is that while men are often promoted based on potential, women often have to prove it again and again and again. And the but here takes a very different tone.
That's so interesting, Melanie. I haven't thought of it like that. I'm curious to know too, what is really unique about Beyond Leaning In? Why write a business book as a novel?
Yeah, that's one of the first questions I often get. On the cover of my book, it says a new kind of novel to spark discussion and change. And a lot of people will say, why did you write a business book as a novel? So I talked a little bit about how I became really frustrated as I started to notice these challenges around me and started to see how with Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, there was so much focus on that there was almost an ignoring of all of the other challenges. I realized that there must be more out there. And I became a little bit obsessive. I started just reading as much as I could. I probably across 5 years or so read thousands of pages of literature, everything I could find on the challenges that women faced in the workplace. I interviewed hundreds of women. I was the kind of person, if you were sitting next to me on an airplane or if we were at a barbecue or really anywhere, introduced to a friend of a friend who I knew was a professional woman, I would just start asking them questions to try to get a sense of the challenges they would face. And what was fascinating to me was how universal the challenges were, that I could talk to women at all layers of the organization, employers large and small, different industries, and people all had the same stories. The more I heard these stories, the more I thought, well, these stories need to be told, but how do we tell those stories so that folks listen and understand them? And yeah, I thought there's so many amazing business books out there that often I would talk to colleagues and I would say, hey, did you read such and such business book? And they would say, oh, I think the Harvard Business Review article was enough. I don't need to read the full book. And I thought, wow, how much they miss. And so I got excited about the idea of just using the research. Beyond Leaning In has lots of footnotes, but it's actually almost a fictionalized case study. It is told through the story of multiple characters. We actually switch back and forth between the perspectives of characters across genders, across generations, up and down the organizational chart. You kind of see what's going on, almost a 360-degree perspective of one fictional employer. And at the beginning, we meet the main character. Her name is Deborah. She's the CEO. She's a baby boomer. She has fought to smash those glass ceilings. She's come to a position of power. She's mentored a lot of women. And yet she's finding that women are engaged at lower rates than men, according to their organizational engagement survey. She's finding that women are quitting at higher rates than men, and she's trying to understand why. And so we meet Deborah, we meet all of these different characters at the organization. My hope is that this makes it more of a fast-paced story, that you kind of get invested in wanting to know what happens to Deborah, wanting to know what happens to all these characters we meet, and that kind of secretly you're absorbing a lot of the research along the way. But there are also a few other reasons. I found that in attending a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations, that often DEI trainings would kind of spiral out of control and out of the main topic because people would start defending the well-intended. And what I mean by that is you read a case study about unconscious bias, and it talks about somebody who maybe unintentionally committed a microaggression. And the discussion should be on, okay, what was the negative impact of that microaggression? One of our themes here is allyship. And I think one of the main things we can all do as allies is understand that unconscious biases have an impact on the organization, on individuals, and that we need to figure out what to do with that. But often what I'd seen in unconscious bias training and heard throughout these hundreds of interviews was that they would sort of devolve, because then the whole group would start discussing the person who had committed the unconscious bias. Well, they didn't mean it. Well, this is what else was going on. These are the millions of reasons, and we explain them away. And so what I hope to show by telling the story as a novel is that there are all of these characters. None of them are villains. You won't find in my book any men who go about talking about how women are inferior. You won't find any obvious sexual predators, the kinds of really bad actors. What you find are a lot of good people that are trying to do the right thing and unintentionally do the wrong thing. And my hope is that we're able to kind of see that play out. There's also really amazing research from psychologists on how reading novels can help build empathy. And so by writing the book through the perspective of multiple characters, again, of all kinds of demographics, what I hope is that readers can make sense of their own experience, because most readers will find a character that they identify with, or a set of characters that they identify with, and it helps them understand themselves. But also it helps readers understand the perspective of those unlike themselves.
That's so interesting too, that it would teach us more about empathy just in reading a novel. I think the book itself probably as a whole gives you a perspective of empathy, both from the side of the leader and as the follower. But yeah, I'm curious to know along those lines about the topic of male allyship. You and I have talked previously about how you've joined several discussion groups with entirely male readers, and that 30% of your podcast listeners are men. So what are some of the key things that male readers typically take away?
Yeah, I think this is such an important topic. One of my pet peeves about discussions around women in leadership is that they're often just groups of women talking to one another. And we need that space. It's really important, but we're not going to solve the problem unless men are involved in the conversation as well. And so I love, I've been invited to a few book clubs of just all male readers. One recently was all male readers over the age of 70, and they were wonderful and just really wanted to get into the issues. I think that a lot of women actually think that men won't want to be involved in the topic, but I've found that across genders, it's best to have really engaged conversation about this. A lot of my female readers have also had their male partners read it, and that's always an interesting discussion. Sometimes I'll talk to female and male partners who read the book together, and they talk about their different experiences in reading it. So I hope male readers take away a few things, one of which is there's no magic bullet to the problem. A friend of mine who's a professor at a business school, and she writes a lot on gender and business. And she mentioned to me that often she'll talk to a male colleague and they'll say to her something like, oh, well, I know all about the problem of women in leadership. My wife or my sister or my daughter or female colleague tells me that she deals with X. And then they'll kind of assume that that's the only problem, and that if we just solve X, then everything will be okay again. I think that was why Lean In was so sort of seductive in a way, was because it was this idea of, okay, there's just one thing that we can fix. And what I hope a lot of male readers take away, what a lot of them will say to me, is that they realize, oh, actually, how many different things they didn't notice, because often these are conversations that women are having behind closed doors. And they're not necessarily thinking. I see in the chat, Gina mentioned the impact as a result of microaggressions. I'll show a comic later that talks a little bit more about that. That's something often women are kind of having these side conversations about it behind closed doors, or noticing something but not even talking to friends about it because they're worried that it's just them. And so what I hope is that we get a sense of the systemic nature of the problem. A lot of male managers have told me that they've taken a second look at how they assign work as well. That they've seen also the importance of things like bystander intervention training. This is something that I think needs to be paired with any unconscious bias training. We need bystander intervention training to know what we do with it. But probably the most frequent takeaway from men is all the ways they need to change their behaviors as well. And this was something Dr. Steinberg had alluded to earlier, but I'll show you a few more comics I've drawn along these lines. And I posted several dozen comics on Instagram. You can see my Instagram at the bottom there. If you'd like to follow or contact me there, but I'll say this is the comic that I've gotten the most. You can see your Instagram metrics, and you can see what people share, either privately message to others or share on their story. And this is the one that people share the most. And at the top here, you can see women are constantly told to do things like talk louder, interrupt, take up space, like men are socialized to do. And are men told to do things like listen and amplify others' voices, like women are socialized to do. This is something that I talk a lot about in my book and in talks, especially with male groups, as the difference between what I think of as points versus assists. And this is a metaphor from basketball. I remember that as a kid, my dad loved watching basketball. And we'd watch games together, and he would always say to me, look, that player got a point and that player got an assist. But people don't care about the assists as much, but they should, because the team can't get overall as many points unless you have assists. To me, this is the perfect metaphor to think about how meeting behaviors work. That in meetings, often you have folks that are looking to score points. And that might be saying something like, my opinion is that, or here's a statement worded as a pretend question. And you have people who are socialized to think about assists. And that might be, I know you disagree and I would like to hear your view. Or Haley had a good idea at the last meeting. Again, an assist doesn't mean just talking about people who agree with you. It's actually advancing the organization's collective aims. And that might mean even looking for areas of conflict. And this is an area where women, there's a lot of great research on this, women are often socialized to care more about the assist, and men are often socialized for the point. And yet in a lot of our organizations and a lot of our culture, it's the points that are valued. I remember myself in school and in work often being told that, hey, you need to learn how to interrupt. You need to learn how to bulldoze others, talk louder, talk faster, get yourself in that conversation. And in addition to the fact that often there are women like myself who did benefit from, okay, maybe I do need to raise my hand a little bit more to lean in even. But are we also telling men who may have been socialized that way that it's important also to listen, to contribute? There's been a great conversation on social media across the last year. I think this is getting new ground around the concept of weaponized incompetence. It used to be called office housekeeping. And it's this idea that there are a lot of activities, both in personal lives and in professional lives, where women often take on the disproportionate burden. That might be who takes the notes at the meetings, for example, or who brings baked goods, or who cleans up physically, whether in the kitchen or in the office kitchen, or after an office party. I'll actually put in the chat a blog post I wrote on this. Recently, there was a woman on TikTok last fall who posted a great video of the grocery list that she sends her husband with to the grocery store. And it was just detail of pictures of every single item. And that actually just sparked this whole conversation on why does this happen? How does this happen? A friend of mine talked about how she noticed it happening even with her elementary school age kids, that she would watch them at the park and see how afterwards there was a school group playing tennis, and the coach told all the kids to clean up, and the girls were cleaning up the tennis balls and the boys were goofing off with the coach. And afterwards, they all got some kind of point, some kind of reward for cleaning up, even though only the girls were cleaning up. And what my friend said was interesting about it wasn't just that it happened, but that a lot of the parents were watching it and said nothing. And we're kind of laughing about it with these boys will be boys. And so I think we all think that with future generations are more woke and more aware of these things that are going on. And yet looking at this group of probably Generation Z or Generation Alpha kids, likely millennial parents, people are very aware of these things theoretically, but that the biases are so ingrained that we keep on doing them anyway. And so I think for male allies, what they've said to me is they've realized it's important for them to be aware of the biases so that they can recognize them, so that they can catch them, but also that they need to be aware of their own actions and where are they where have they benefited in the past from these kinds of structures where women take on disproportionate tasks, whether it's the taking the notes at the meeting or it's the being the ones who are listening and advancing the collective aims in meeting culture. Okay, that was a long response. I have a lot to say on this.
Yeah, that's great though. I think if we want true equity, there needs to be listening and response on both sides of the playing field. You mentioned generations and talking about allyship across generations. That's a big theme in your book. I'm curious to know how you see women across different generations having different perspectives and what some examples of that might be.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite conversations to have because I think it's not one that we have often enough. Often there's a lot of misunderstanding, and there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to generations, right? How often do we hear stereotypes about generations, whether it's the okay boomer, or I think sometimes older generations think of millennials or Gen Z, and they think entirely about technology. And there's so much more in terms of subtle generational shifts. One of them, I'll show another comic I drew. I call this one Mother-Daughter Movie Night. And it is at the top picturing a scene from one of my favorite films, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which I recommend to everyone. But there's a scene in the film where the daughter, adult daughter, says to her mother, she's really frustrated with how the mother is kind of always deferring to the father and making decisions. And the mother says to her daughter, Tula, the man is the head of the house, but the woman is the neck, and she can turn the head any way she wants. Right. And I distinctly remember seeing this play out in the movie. I actually wrote it down, I think, in my journal that night after watching the film, because it's advice that women get a lot. And in this case, it's talking about marriage. But actually, if you look below that, what I wanted to depict in this comic was the mother and daughter talking to one another. And the mother saying, remember that at work too, get men to think things are their idea. And the daughter saying, I don't know, mom, there's got to be another way. And to me, this represents a lot of the generational shifts that we see, which are that for a lot of older generations, I mean, they had to fight those big fights, push those boulders up those hills, deal with explicit sexism, right? Just not even being allowed to be in the room at all. And in doing so, rightly, they kind of had to pick their battles. And in picking their battles, there were definite areas where, okay, the way you got power was to get men, in this example, to get men to think things were their idea. And when we talk to younger generations, a lot of them are pushing back and saying, well, why does it have to be that way? And a lot of women I talk to actually feel trapped in the middle. That's how I felt. I'll age myself. And I was born in 1979, which is sort of the last year of Generation X. And so I probably identify a lot more with millennial culture and values in a lot of different ways. I think my generation, micro generation, is called Zennial, Xennial, or the Oregon Trail generation. And when I talk to a lot of women kind of around my age range and level of seniority, we often felt trapped in the middle, because I know that I got to my position as a senior vice president partly by doing this, by getting men to think things were their idea. And yet I always feel really uncomfortable about passing that advice along. I don't want women to have to do that, but uncomfortable about not passing that advice along, because as we try to figure out things systemically and try to make it so it's not this, this is still also very much the reality. And I think in terms of generations, just having that more open conversation is helpful, because we do see that I think otherwise there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of younger women thinking perhaps that women of older generations just don't have their back, and women of older generations sometimes thinking that younger generations don't know what they've been through and why they had to pick their battles. Another difference I see, and actually when I'm often asked what gives me encouragement about where things are headed, this is one thing. And it's that things that women have historically valued at work more than men did, and things that younger generations, both men and women, value at work more than previous generations did, you can sort of see a Venn diagram. This is something we see a lot in my book through some of the perspectives of the younger male characters, that things like authenticity in leadership or inclusive culture, work-life balance, or personal meaning at work. These have long been characteristics about workplaces that research has shown women value more than men. But now what we see is that younger generations of all genders are valuing these at work more than previous generations. And I do think that we'll start to see some shift because as a whole, there is more emphasis on that listening culture, that amplifying others' voices culture.
That's so great. I'm curious too, after sharing your comics, thank you for sharing, by the way. I think it's so generous to be able to share your art and your words with our audience here today. So in addition to drawing your own comics about DEI at work, we know that you also guide workshops where participants go through drawing exercises that help them take their DEI initiatives to the next level. I'm curious to know, what have you learned from this?
Yeah, so let me show, I know I keep sharing my screen on and off, but I love showing some of these. And this is actually my favorite comic to share because it does get to, as Gina had mentioned in the chat, that kind of impact of microaggressions. And it's a comic I love using in my workshops. So I call this comic the Cupcake Trap. It's based on a scene in Beyond Leaning In, where on the left side, the CEO in the book, the CEO, Deborah, actually realizes that this was a memo she sent out. And this is her kind of coming to terms and starting to understand things that she hadn't realized were going on. She was so busy getting so much done, hadn't realized all these little things that were going on. In this promotion memo, we congratulate two employees. Their names are Mike and Mara, and they're both promoted to the same position as analytics manager. And Mike is applauded here for leading the analysis for a critical project that led to $5 million in revenues. And Mara is applauded for her fantastic work ethic and great baking skills. And it says all of us have gained a few pounds from her cupcakes. I'll just say as a side note here, when I was interviewing women for the research for the book, the topic of baking came up so frequently. I can't tell you how many times women talked about baking, how they were worried that if they baked too much, they'd be judged the wrong way, but maybe they needed to bake a little bit to be seen as feminine. I know I'll tell my story, which is that I baked a lot earlier in my career. I stopped at a certain point because I felt like it might hold me back. And then I started again when I was too senior to care. But below that, we see a guy who's saying, what's the big deal? They both got promoted. And often this is the response, right? We might see something like this. It could be in a promotion memo. We might hear something like this. It could just be in how people are introduced. I mentioned Chad and Haley earlier in one of the first comics we looked at. You know, Chad might be introduced for his great data skills, and Haley is introduced for her infectious smile and being the glue of the office. It's something we see throughout my book. And so it's not just these formal moments like promotion memos, it's these informal moments, how people are introduced in the hallway, at the beginning of a Zoom conversation, informally. And often we don't even recognize it because it's so ingrained, it's so normal, it's so part of the vocabulary. But even when we do recognize it, I think this guy at the bottom left, I could have, it could have been someone of any gender here, but what I wanted to draw was someone saying, what's the big deal? They both got promoted, because often that's the reply. Okay, this isn't ideal, but does it matter? This is the problem to me with the phrase microaggression. It's a correct phrase, but the word micro undermines it because we think, why does it matter if it's micro? And what I hope to show on the right side is why it matters. In the top right, I drew these two individuals here. I'll tell you, this could be 2 weeks later. This could be a year later. One of them says, I'm looking for project help. Maybe they looked at an organizational chart. They need an analytics manager. They looked at an organizational chart. They saw Mike or Mara on the list. And so they're asking their colleague, what do you know about Mike or Mara? And their colleague says, I heard Mike is great. I don't know much about Mara. Now, what I think is important here is these two people may have never met Mike or Mara, or maybe they've just met them casually. They don't know anything about them. They're not necessarily harboring any individual bias of their own. They do not know these people. But what we see here in the yellow box, people remember Mike for the revenues versus Mara for the cupcakes. That's why these little things add up. And what I love to do in my workshops is actually guide participants in drawing the next 4 squares after this. People don't have to be artists. It's more about drawing as a way to brainstorm. We use stick figures and make it fun and easy. But we start to draw, okay, what's the impact on Mara? And it makes people reflect. Oh, yeah, I have people actually draw feelings. And how did Mara feel before when she heard about her promotion? How did Mara feel after she saw this memo? And how that promotion gets lessons for Mara. And in the meantime, Mike feels good, right? Mike gets this extra boost of confidence from the memo. And that's really important too when we think about allyship and as men think about their own allyship. And part of it is recognizing that if there are occasions where women feel less confident, where there's a confidence gap, part of it is because of scenarios like this. There's often the sense that women come into the workplace or into school settings less confident, but actually Mara's confidence is sort of whittled away, right? Because she's wondering, is she being seen for her revenue skills? Why wasn't she recognized? Maybe she brought in $6 million in revenues. Why isn't that being recognized? Her confidence gets whittled away. Mike's confidence gets boosted even further. And that's just the impact on these two individuals. What about the impact on the organization? I have people draw a employee at this organization. Okay, and how's that employee doing? And what's their goal? And why is their goal not met because of this memo? And so people might draw somebody at this organization who has a goal. Maybe they have a big project. Maybe it's this person we see here in the top right. And this person should have selected Mara for the project. She's the person with the right skills, but he overlooks that. They overlook that and they work with Mike instead. And maybe the project doesn't succeed and maybe the company loses a lot of money for that. Or people will draw, maybe there's a younger employee that looks up to Mara and they think that they need to bake to get promoted. And they either start baking because of that, or maybe they leave the firm, or maybe they just feel bad about themselves and they don't think they'll get promoted and they end up changing their career path. We can come up with a lot of different scenarios of how just these little things like this can have a ripple effect. After that, I had people draw solutions. And what's actually exciting to me about that is that I asked people to think about all the reasons why this promotion memo happens. And when folks actually start to think about it, they realize how many points of intervention there are. That there's the person who sent this memo. Okay, there could have been a bias check on the communications. The person who sent this memo, say in this case, it was Deborah, the CEO, the fictional CEO. She didn't write the memo herself. Somebody gave her the information. Okay, the managers of Mike and Mara gave Deborah the information. So we could have given them a template. So they put the same kind of information in the template. But even if we gave them a template, maybe there's a problem because Mike brought in the $5 million yesterday. Mara brought in $6 million, but it was 3 months ago. And yesterday she baked. And we all have recency bias. And so her manager remembers the baking. Okay, well, then we need to give managers training about how to keep track of stuff across the year. Well, maybe Mara is baking a lot because women are ones who are often volunteering to be on event planning committees, and men often don't volunteer as much for those. And that's why she's known for her baking. Okay, well, maybe we need to even things out a little bit and ensure that there's an equitable way that people are assigned to things like planning events or assigned to things like bringing the baked goods for events. We could have a chart chart rotate who does that. But I could keep going. When people are sort of forced to think about the story, and this is where I do think that fiction helps depersonalize it. We're not feeling attacked by it or defensive about it. We're just trying to understand the people in the story. And if we think about the people in the story, we realize all of the ways that we got here and all of the ways that we could potentially address it.
There's so much to take away from the comics. I think what I'm finding is it's just pushing my thinking forward, and it makes me think more deeply about something that it takes my defensiveness away from how I might respond in this situation, because it's in a comic. It's easier to find yourself in that story. Yeah, thank you again so much for sharing. That's all the questions that I have, but I'm curious to know if there are any questions that the audience has for you, if they want to know any more about the work that you do or about your book. Feel free to put your questions in the chat or hop off mute and ask your questions to Melanie.
Hi, Melanie. It's nice to see you. Uh, I had a question about as you've been talking about the book on calls like this and discussions, are there any big messages that, like, your first time through with the draft and the book as it stands, that like you would like add as part of like an extended or additional or deeper learning that that came out in a lot of the conversations you had since the original publication?
Yes, and one of them was actually inspired by you. So this is Stephen Lafamina, who is one of the guests on my podcast, season 1 of the Beyond Leaning In podcast. You can find on my website. And Stephen and his wife Veronica are on episode 2, which is called The Mental Autocomplete, and they actually react to the scene from the book that has that cupcake trap comic. So everyone, give it a listen. And I think I would probably do more to show all of the things that happen at a younger age that get us to that point, because there's so much. A lot of the response I'll get sometimes from people who read the book is, well, all of this is getting better now, right? Because younger generations are more aware. And that's where I shared the story earlier of my friend who watched the kids playing tennis on the playground, and the boys and girls having different expectations for cleanup. And again, by parents who I'm going to guess have been through lots of unconscious bias trainings themselves. And Stephen, in the episode that we did, talks a lot about how, Stephen, you can probably obviously explain your own story better than I can, but Stephen talks about how with his son, or actually Veronica talks about how Stephen with their son, when watching TV shows, for example, that center male characters, will say, okay, what about the girl's story? Does he have a sister? Stephen, let me let you tell your own story.
Oh yeah, it was an observation that I have a younger son, a younger daughter, and in watching children's TV, there's like this preponderance of male protagonists, and you sit there and you're like, wait a second, it's just one, right? Like everyone, like Octonauts, Captain Barnacle is the guy, he's a polar bear, he's in charge, right? It's like, if you look at that theme, kind of is through all of it. So we're like, wait a second. So we like take moments to call that out with our kids, and then actively find different kind of protagonists and to show women in leadership positions, even in like youth cartoons. So
and I think that how we can kind of fill in the gaps in the open space is really important. This is a spoiler. In the book, it's a spoiler, but I don't think a spoiler that disrupts the reading experience. In the book, I actually don't give physical descriptions to the characters because I don't want their race or ethnicity to be clear. And around page 100, there's a reveal where you get a sense of a few different racial backgrounds of the characters. And most people will admit, and kind of in whispered tones, like, Melanie, I thought all the characters were white until I got to that point. And what does that say about me? And what it says is that default representation in our society, because of all of the things that we see, is white. And often without the signals, that's what we kind of assume. And so I think that's a really important part of it. One thing I've been thinking about just adding in terms of discussion questions, for example, is, okay, there are assumptions we make about all of the characters, some of which I, as a writer, didn't even know that I was making. There's one character who there's a little bit of a tense relationship with his father. And his father, going back to generational gaps, his father is sort of more old school, isn't going to think about female allyship to women at all. The younger male character is doing his best and wants to be a better ally. And a friend of mine said, well, let's take that father character. And most people probably have in their head that father character as, a rich dude on the golf course. What if that father was a fairly recent immigrant? And you kind of add different layers based on all kinds of factors of identity or background to any character, and we could read them all in different ways. So this is probably too ambitious. I don't know exactly how I do this, but part of me wants to make like a choose your own adventure version of the book. Anyway.
That would be so fun. I would love to do that.
And check out the podcast for the episode with Stephen and Veronica and all the other episodes.
Hi, Melanie. My name is Bill Davis, and I would like to say that, I came here with an open mind, and I'm always open to experience, and I love lifelong learning. And right now, I'm kind of at the back end of my career, and I'm not going to date myself here, but I've been working in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the new millennium, and so forth. And and first of all, congratulations on your wonderful research in your book, because I really love your passion. I see your strong sense of purpose, and I know you're looking to impact positive change, within this world. So I admire that. I read a book not too long ago, Chasing Relevance by Dan Negroni, and he talked all about the millennials and the population and the data. And some of it parallels a little bit of what you're talking about, the different views and the different perceptions. And here's my question. I love lifelong learning. I love teaching. I love furthering student success. And so this is really great. When you look at the environments today, one of the things I was taught at in my PepsiCo days was, when you see behaviors, don't reward them, necessarily redirect them, but don't necessarily run with them. So when you see some of these things, and again, I didn't read your book yet, but I'm going to, when you see these behaviors and some of these nuances and different things you're picking up, I saw somebody put micro expression in the box. Do you feel that today's companies like HR departments and stuff are there to use the soft skills, the finesse, and tap it in place and kind of get things going down the right track, or do we still need to catch up today in organizations? I guess that would be my question, if you have a view on that, because you've surfaced, some very realistic issues, that occur. So that's my question. I mean, does the training not only need to be absorbed by, us as people and employees, but is there more of an awareness type training that needs to occur, for example, with human resource personnel? I mean, if companies caught up to where your vision is at, is my question.
Most companies have not caught up. I think that at most organizations, and I empathize with anyone leading large organizations today, it's hard work and at a time of so many shifts. And most organizations have not invested what they need to in HR and talent generally. I think that unfortunately, HR is still largely seen as a compliance function, and HR folks are overwhelmed by policies and processes and how much they have to do. That when I talk to most HR folks, I know they want to spend more time on overall culture and leadership development and on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they don't have the time because they're sort of buried in a lot of the process work and day to day. And I think that just means that we need two things, both largely more investment in HR and talent and learning and development, but also an understanding that there's only so much that can happen centrally. A lot of what happens here is by managers and day to day, and that these equity issues are everybody's issues to deal with. And that's something that needs to be taken into account in how managers are evaluated and rewarded. I do think there are small things that organizations can do day to day. They're just not often consistently applied. So for example, one I'll just put out to the group that is helpful as a bystander intervention technique that we did occasionally at my old firm was just use the phrase perspective check. So a lot of times we go through these unconscious bias trainings. And then, for example, in a performance review discussion, our leadership team would sit around the table. We'd evaluate the performance of our staff the last 6 months. Often people would notice somebody else making a bias statement, maybe committing a microaggression, but they didn't know what to do about it.
Okay.
Maybe they would email the HR person and say, hey, stop that. Or they're most likely going to just whisper to their friend next to them about it, right? Or whisper to someone else after that. And what we started doing was just implementing the phrase perspective check. And we all came to an agreement, hey, unconscious biases exist. Some of us will unintentionally commit them. If you hear someone say something that you feel uncomfortable with, all you have to do is raise your hand and say perspective check as a way to redirect the discussion. And that was really helpful because it did depersonalize it, and it ensured that we were dealing with things in the moment.
Very nice. Thank you very much. And by the way, I think you're a great artist too. I love your cartoons and how you make your point and you sew it all together. So
thank you.
Yes, good luck to you.
Thank you. The drawing is actually pretty new for me, so I'm always glad to hear that. And before I forget, I'm going to put in the chat a link to a special giveaway for those of you attending today to sign up for my email list. You will get a copy of all the slides emailed to you, but you'll also be entered into a giveaway for 3 signed copies of my book that you can for yourself or to give to a friend.
That's so generous, Melanie. Thank you so much. I would definitely take advantage of that. I know I've already added it to my cart, so I'm going to be buying it soon. We got one more question that came in the chat. It says, what effect do you see remote work having on the gender biases in organizations, since baking is out these days, for example, and there's less water cooler talk?
Yeah, that is a tough one, because I think there's been a short-term benefit for women and people of color that partly has to do with the removal of some microaggressions, or they're not as obvious. So there's some research showing that, I'll use an example that has nothing to do with DEI and then get to DEI. There's some research that shows, for example, that people were happier with their managers when remote work started happening. And Peter Capelli, who's one of the great scholars on the future of work, when he wrote about it, he said, well, you actually don't know why this is. There's a good chance that people were happy with their managers during remote work, either because they didn't like their managers and they didn't have to see them that often, or because so many organizations mandated weekly check-ins during remote work and had never done so before. And so this is actually just revealing that things weren't good before the pandemic. It's not that actually remote work is better for managers or that managers have gotten better. And I think that for all of the many advantages that come with flexible work, and I generally am a proponent, I'll say that first up front about flexible work, for all the benefits of it. One of the benefits was that for women, people of color, and other historically marginalized groups, they didn't feel as excluded, because there weren't the moment of seeing, the guys all going out for golf, for example, or the executives only stopping by certain desks rather than others to make small talk. And so what we saw is a removal of microaggressions and unconscious biases on display. And my worry is that there are so many benefits to flexible work, but that with time, because so many employers aren't giving much thought to it. And again, I empathize. I think employers are overwhelmed right now. And so hybrid work is the sort of necessity, and remote work is the sort of necessity that people have adopted, but they haven't thought through it, right? What should be synchronous? What should be asynchronous? Much like in an online education program, there's a thought that goes into it. It's not random. We think through what should be asynchronous and synchronous, when it makes sense for people to come in person if it is a hybrid program. And employers need to adopt that same sort of care, and they're not. And so, I think a lot of the concerns I have are related to who's in the office and who's not. And because most research shows that the top level executives all want to be in the office and will remain largely in the office, it will lead to several biases. One of them is presenteeism. People will be seen as better performers just by being present. There's another psychological term called the halo effect. And the halo effect means that because you have a positive impression of someone from one occasion, you transplant that into another area. So for example, you could have a positive impression of someone from the water cooler because you made nice conversation, and then assume that their work is good. And if we end up in a world where it is more women who are taking advantage of flexible arrangements and more men who are in the office, and your top executives are in the office, it is going to end up exacerbating some of the gender gaps.
That's really interesting. I am curious to know more about the presenteeism and the halo effect, so I'll be looking those things up as well.
Yeah, look up. So Peter Capelli has a recent book about hybrid. I can't remember what it's called, probably something like Future of Work. But he talks in it about several call center studies from China pre-pandemic. And in these call center studies, they show that when a certain percentage of their employees went remote, their work product was the same. The remote employees did fine or even better. But when it came to promotion, the remote employees were disadvantaged. And that was for employees who started out all together in person. For employees who started remote, there was even more of a gap because they never had that initial period of networking. All of this can be solved through
Right.
ways of structuring hybrid and remote. So I'm hopeful that at some point employers will be able to spend the time they need on that.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for one last question. I'm curious to know, what would you say your biggest tip is for our leaders here today on authentic leadership, which is our theme for July?
Oh, to me, authentic leadership is about values, and having values that are about and I say this because I often think, I don't know why my mind just goes to the negative right away sometimes, but I think sometimes people misread the idea of authentic leadership and like take radical candor too far, and they think that means tell everybody everything that's on your mind all the time. And so I've actually seen a lot of leaders under the guise of authentic leadership, for example, get in front of groups of people and say like, well, I'm not sure how the budget's going to work out. And we're still like, I don't know how it's a little bit of they're taking their internal narrative in their head and externalizing everything and actually giving their employees less confidence. So the idea of authentic leadership to me is a really important one because it is about having leading not based on self-interest or based on ego, but leading based on why something matters to you, leading based on the values, I love the idea of servant leadership also, leading based on caring about those who are seeing those that you're leading as in your care and being true to supporting them all and being your best selves and then kind of accomplishing visions. So yeah, I think that's what authentic leadership should be. And my worry is when people kind of take it in this weird way, which is like, I'm going to just say whatever's on my mind.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh, thank you so much for sharing today. We have a lot of other events in July on authentic leadership. I'll share those in a minute, but I just wanted to thank you, Melanie, for your time and your passion, your energy that you gave to the center today. I look forward to seeing all of you sign up for Melanie's newsletter and also go and check out her giveaway and enter yourself for that. And check out her website, her Instagram, buy her book. She's got so many resources.
Yeah, and if anyone had a question that you think of tomorrow or later, or you felt too shy to type in or ask today, I reply to every message I get. So feel free to email me or connect to me on any social media channel, and I'd love to hear from you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Melanie. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
We have a bunch of events coming up with the rest of July. Next up is July 14th, the Future Self Workshop with Megan Gilmore. July 21st, we have Authentic Leadership with Larissa. And July 28th, we have a community chat on gender acceptance and pronouns. All really great things coming up, and we'd love to see you there. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.